Okay, let me call each of these guys up. Well, first of all, come on up, have a seat. Dick Simon, next to him. Bernie Greenwald. And last but not least, Barney Zaffron. Come on up, sit by your name. In the meantime, while they're coming up, let's just kind of review what's going to be going on here. Each veteran's going to have 15 minutes, both comprising of both their storytelling and 2 or 3 minutes, or questions rather, from the audience. Short questions. As I said, each veteran will have roughly 10 to 12 minutes to speak. And then we'll go into some couple of questions. At the end, when everybody has told their story and the individual questions been posed to them, then it'll be open to everybody from the membership to ask any questions you want. And that's how it's going to go. So I will be the timekeeper at this point, and we will start with good old Ralph, and away you go. You can sit there. Sit there. Mic on? No, push it up. Back. Back. The light goes on its own.
Now can you hear it okay? Okay. I'm going to recite my military experience in World War II, basically. Actually started out before the war. I had been in ROTC in college, and I got called in August of 41, before Pearl Harbor, and sent to school in Washington, D.C., finished school and was assigned to Fort Huachuca, Arizona. I went down, in those days you traveled by train, so I went down to the railway station to get a ticket to Fort Huachuca, and the guy works around on it a while, and finally he comes back and says, "Let me sell you a ticket to El Paso and let them figure out how to get you to Fort Huachuca." So that was what happened. I got a ticket to El Paso, and they got me a ticket to Hereford, Arizona. Well, you probably never heard of it. I don't think anybody has. When I arrived there at 4 in the morning, there was a building about 10 by 20, and a 2.5-ton truck there to pick up some freight and me. 40 miles still from Fort Huachuca. We got to Fort Huachuca. Good experience for me, all black troops and all white officers. I had had no experience with black colleagues up till that time, so I had a good experience learning. I got there over there at about 6 in the morning, and they took me to the officers' club, and I cleaned up and had breakfast and went over to report in so I could go get quarters and so on. I report in, the post executive officer says, "Oh, we've been waiting for you. Here's your desk here. You're the post adjutant. The commander and I are just leaving. We're going someplace, and go ahead." I didn't know any more than what I'd learned in getting there from the railway station. So I had an experience. Fortunately, I had an intercom phone to Sergeant Franklin, an old regular Army Master Sergeant, and he knew everything. Oh, the phone would ring, and I'd answered it, and they'd say something, just a minute, and I'd buzz Sergeant Franklin, and he'd tell me the answer, and we got along well that way. Well, actually, Pearl Harbor came on. We heard it while having breakfast one morning. And from there on, immediately they put us on guarding the border with Mexico, afraid of Japanese troops coming in through Mexico. But before long, I got orders to 37th Division, which was the Ohio National Guard Division, which had been called in, was on duty in Louisiana, Mississippi, actually. And before I could leave to join them, I got orders to meet them in Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. So we got there, and we're going to Europe on the Normandy. And if you remember, the Normandy burned at the pier in New York, and so we didn't go on it, and we got orders to go to the West Coast, and loaded on 5 different trains. The one I was on went up into Canada and then down all the way to El Paso, to Los Angeles, and up to San Francisco. We got there finally, and we got issued Arctic gear, so we knew we were going to Alaska. And we got on the ship in the San Francisco harbor there. And before we could get under the Golden Gate Bridge, 90% of the troops were seasick. And you can imagine a troop ship with all the seasick. Anyway, we get out in the ocean away, and a destroyer came sliding up. There were 5 of the ships, all a presidential line. I was on the Madison. Anyway, the Coolidge was the commander, and the destroyer came up and gave the division commander orders, and we weren't going to Alaska, we were going to Fiji. And although you couldn't land everybody at Fiji at one time, they didn't have facilities. Ship I'm on went to New Zealand. And we had a good time in New Zealand. Actually, all the troops from New Zealand were up in the Middle East, and they were tickled to death to have us rather than the Japanese. And we were treated like royalty. So we were there gradually. We got filtered up to Fiji and spent a year on Fiji building defenses, basically concerned about Japanese attack coming down towards Australia and New Zealand. We there, and after a year, got orders to Guadalcanal, and arrived there just in time one day to get unloaded, and the ships had to get out of there because the Japanese bombers came down every night. And most of the fighting had been done on Guadalcanal, and the Marines had done most of it. We had a little cleanup operation, but every night the Japs would send 2 planes down, Washing Machine Charlie, they called because they sounded like washing machine motors, and they would come over and circle around, and we'd get searchlights on them. We shoot $1 million worth of anti-aircraft, never hit anything. Basically, I think they were trying to keep us awake and so on. The Air Force liaison guy with us, Lamphere, left and went back to the Air Force, and he got on they sent up night fighters to try to get these, but the night fighters stayed out of the anti-aircraft area. And we listened on the radio, and they were getting their instructions and so on. And they say, now look up at the moon and you can probably see him. Well, they never got any. Lamphere went up, and he ignored orders. He made one pass, shot them both down. Here they are out there in the lights, and nobody had figured if you just quit anti-aircraft and one fighter could shoot these guys down. He got them both in one fight, and that ended the Japanese coming down at night and saved us a lot of anti-aircraft money. Well, from there, we spent a year in the Solomons, on Guadalcanal and New Georgia, and then Bougainville. And we had a fight on all of those, a big one on Bougainville. We were building, defending an airfield there, and the Japs were trying to knock it out. They were on the other side of the island. And we had a big fight there. Fortunately, we still had the airport at the end. From there, we got orders to go to prepare to go to the Philippines. I can't say the name of the assembly place. A huge group of islands to the west of the Solomons. And we were there, and New Year's Eve. And I don't know, I guess there were 500,000 troops, big convoy of ships, and it was the biggest drunk that you ever saw. They didn't have any glasses, they had empty beer cans, and the bartender would open a bottle of whiskey and empty it in about 6 beer cans, and those would go, and it was a, but if the Japs had attacked then, they'd had easy mark. But they didn't, and we went from there to, we decided there, and we were ordered into the Philippines. We went on that landing that came in at Lingayen Gulf. And it was towards the end of the cruise, we went through the Visayan Islands and came up on the west side of Luzon. And the Japanese Air Force then was after us the last day. And there was, and we had fighters up, and all sorts of anti-aircraft firing off the ships. Those of you that were in some of that know how chaotic that is. And you see these Japanese fighters coming in and coming down kamikaze to try to crash that, and then all the shooting, you swear nothing could get through all that, and most of them didn't. And sooner or later, something would hit them and they'd explode, and parts of planes would come down all around. And then we made the landing the next morning in Lingayen, and interesting, going in, we went in under a battleship, and I realized you can, the battleship was firing, and you could see the shells going over. I never realized that was possible. In any case, the Navy shot up a lot of, particularly the supply dumps that the Japanese had up there, and then when we got on shore, we found those supply dumps were actually cemeteries. They buried people above the ground instead of in the wet ground, and we shot up all those cemeteries and didn't bother any supply dumps. But then from there, we got down towards Manila. We got into a strong point, Plaridel. And Kruger, who was the 6th Army commander and was our commander, he came up and says, well, what's going on? And said, well, the strong point, you're holding us up here. He says, well, take your time and work around. Don't lose any more than you have to. Next day, MacArthur comes up here. What's hold up here? If you've read about MacArthur, you can understand. And he says, well, let's get going. Well, Kruger says, take our time and not lose him. Kruger's an old man. Now, Kruger's his chief lieutenant under him, and he's running him down. But MacArthur didn't want any back talk. Anyway, we ended up in Manila, and that was a big fight. And that sort of thing that the Japanese, as some of you know, would come out and wave a white flag or something, and then you let up, and then they'd shoot. And so we had the orders not to take any prisoners. Come in one building, and here's a guy surrenders right away, and so pass him back out, and the battalion commander says, I said, no prisoners. Puts him back in the building and shot him. And so that's kind of the way the wars go. Fortunately, we ended there ultimately, and we made the attack down on Manila, and then went north to the north end, ran the Japs off the north end of Luzon, and the war came to an end.
Okay. Take 2 short questions. Anybody have a short question they want to ask Ralph? There's a man up here with his hand up.
I just just want to let them know I want to get together with them, man, because I was on Guadalcanal when Washington Machine Charlie was shot down. I was in the Marines, and that was 42, I believe. I think it was, I can't remember the date now. I
don't remember
November or
dates well
December
either.
of 42. I was a Marine then. Okay.
Good.
Another question from anybody? If not, we're going to move on to Dick. Okay, Dick?
Yes, good morning. I was drafted in the Bronx, New York, in February 1943. Before being inducted, I was given a physical exam as everybody else is. And when it came to the eye exam, the doctor said, can you please read the chart? I said, what chart? And he looked at me and said, the one on the wall. I replied, what wall? He said, don't worry about a thing. We'll put you up front and you won't miss anything. So from there, I was transported to Camp Upton, Long Island. Is that better? You're welcome. Where I was given inoculations and a duffel bag full of clothing. I didn't realize at the time that I'd be wearing the same color outfits for 3 years. I was then assigned to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, where with my commercial background, I was appointed after a short basic training, I was appointed the company clerk, worked at the headquarters, and in short order, I was assigned to the 1610th Engineer Map Depot team, and we trained for about 2-3 months and was shipped off to Europe. We started out on the line of Manhattan, which is a bit shorter than the Normandy that you had. But we had 11,000 men aboard, and during the trip we would stand at the rear of the ship and watch the zigzag effect of the ship. It had to change directions every 7 minutes because the North Atlantic at that period was adrift with German submarines. So this would avoid a torpedo that might have been aimed at us. Luckily, we made it all the way across, and a day out of England, 2 bombers escorted our ship to make sure we'd get into port safely. Excuse me. We arrived at Liverpool, England, were put on a British freighter, and immediately transported across the channel to Omaha Beach, which you've all heard about. This happened 3 months after the initial invasion, so we were never under fire or had anything directed of that sort toward us. We went across the hedge fields of France and then were assigned to Paris, where we set up our depot to supply maps to General Patton's 7th Army. These maps were quite large. They were about half the size of this table, but twice as wide. And they had every little terrain marked on it, every flower, every rock. So when they approached a new area, they would feel like they were at home. Nothing strange came up at them. And luckily, within a few months, his 7th Army did succeed on their trip to Berlin, and we were near the end of the war. But before that area, we left Paris, went to Langres, France, Dijon, France, and crossed the Rhine to Heidelberg, Germany, which is quite a beautiful town. And after a short period of time, the war ended. It was middle of May 1945, and we were sent to a staging area to be shipped back to the United States in order to get 30-day furloughs and then move on to the Pacific Theater of Operations. We were aboard our ship heading home for our period to be at home when the Japanese surrendered upon the dropping of the atom bombs, as we all know from news reports. and we were given 30-day furloughs, after which we were sent down to Camp Polk, Louisiana. We participated in a parade in New Orleans on that November 1945 in their Armistice Day parade. Of course, they would discharge us. Since most of us lived north, they took care of us down south, as the Army does. So that was my war exploits. And I'd like to add a side note about the former presidential candidate, George McGovern. He was a bombardier, he was a pilot in World War II, stationed in northern Italy. And he flew 35 missions and was on his last mission coming back to his base when he had a bomb lodged up in his bomb bay. And he didn't know what to do. They can't possibly land with it. They blow up. So he picked an empty area in Austria that looked like a barren farmland. He had his crew dislodge the bomb, and as it went down, it destroyed a farmer's house. George never felt right about that. He had a guilt feeling with him for many years. But in 1955, as a senator, he was speaking in Central Europe. And during his talk there, he mentioned his guilt feelings about having destroyed the farmhouse of a peaceful farmer. A hand went up in the audience, and the farmer stood up and said, "I was that man whose home you destroyed." However, we had bomb shelters. We were all safe, and nothing happened except that we lost the house, and we were very grateful that the war was coming to an end. So we have to remember that a lot of these guilt feelings we carry with us probably come from absolutely nothing, that the other person probably didn't take offense, never thought of it as a slight to them, and so we carry it with us. And that's about all, except I would conclude with a prayer from the Talmud that says, we shall lie down in peace and no war anymore.
Okay. Thank you, Dick. Any questions to Dick? Going once, going twice?
Here,
Oh, sorry, okay.
the D-Day invasion will be 75th anniversary next year. I just read a book about it. Can you tell us a little in detail, when you got to Omaha Beach, what did it look like?
Okay. Well, there was no more gunfire. The battle was over 3 months ago, as I said, and it was still strewn with landmines. And our Army engineers had roped it off so anybody departing or landing at Omaha Beach was completely safe. We were then escorted through to the hedgerows of France, which are right beyond the Omaha landing site. And we had no problem with it at all. And so future soldiers landing had no problem either.
Anybody else? All right. Thank you, Dick. Okay, moving on to Bernie.
Bernie Greenwald. I was in medical school when the war broke out, and the Navy came to the medical school to recruit doctors, and I volunteered to sign up for a medical examination, and I passed, and I was given a V-12 commission while I was in medical school. And we had an exercise on Saturday morning. We exercised, did some marching, and we wore uniforms on Saturday. But during the week, we went to medical school, and we did not have any vacation. We went right through in 3.5 years. And when I graduated medical school, I got a commission in the Navy, lieutenant junior grade in the medical corps. And I got a leave of absence for 9 months for an internship at County Hospital. I graduated medical school in 1943, December 1943, and I interned at County the beginning of 1944. When I was at intern at County Hospital, there was a convention at the Chicago Stadium. The convention was FDR's running for his third term. And I was at the stadium when they dropped Henry Wallace from the roster, as they nominated Harry Truman for vice president. When I graduated medical school, I got the commission, lieutenant junior grade, and I got orders to report to Great Lakes. I reported to Great Lakes and found out that there was no housing at Great Lakes, and since I lived in Chicago, I commuted for about a week to Great Lakes, and then I got orders to a CB battalion in California. And this was in 1944. I flew out the first time I ever flew in a plane. It was a twin-engine biplane. It took about 14 hours to get to San Francisco. We made about 5 stops to get there. And in San Francisco, I had to go through some training. I had to pass some swimming tests. And they took me out to a barracks, a bunker at the naval station in Oakland. And the sergeant gave me a .45 and some bullets. It says, load up the gun and fire at the target. And I looked, I never held a gun in my life. I looked at that, he says, oh, one of those. And he showed me how to load the gun and to fire it. And if you ever shot a .45, you know it has a tremendous recoil. That's the only time I've ever fired a gun, and I've never fired a gun since then. I reported to the CB battalion. It was in Port Hueneme, California, which is just north of Los Angeles. I was there for 2 months, and I was a junior medical officer for this battalion. They just got back from the South Pacific, and they were reorganizing. And the senior medical officer appointed me to inspect the heads. And I wrote back home that I became head inspector. And my folks were very pleased. My son's been in the service only for a few weeks, and he's already head inspector. They didn't know what the head inspector did. Anyway, after 2 months in the Navy, in the Seabees, I got orders detaching me from the Seabees to report to the commander of Mine Squadron 104, wherever he may be. And I got aboard a troop transport in San Diego, and we went to the Western Pacific to an atoll, the Ulithi Atoll. The Ulithi Atoll was a huge atoll about 500 miles south of Guam. And it was a relatively secret atoll. No one knew anything about it because it was a huge anchorage. And when we approached the atoll, it looked like we were approaching a modern city. There were a number of aircraft carriers and battleships and cruisers. There were over 700 ships in the atoll, and they were getting prepared for the invasion of Okinawa. I reported to the flagship of the mine fleet of the Pacific, the USS Terror, and presented my orders. And they looked at my orders, and it says, the commander for your mine squadron is living in a tent on the beach. He's waiting for his ship, the USS Pickett. It's being commissioned in Carolina. And I said, it's fine, send me to Carolina. You know, I wasn't that brave to go into combat. So he says, no, he says, we can't do that, but we'll give you additional temporary duty. We'll assign you to the USS Dorsey. The USS Dorsey just got back from the invasion of the Philippines, and they never had a medical officer aboard. You'll be their first medical officer. And we'll give you temporary additional duty on the USS Dorsey. The USS Dorsey was a obsolete ship that was built for service in World War I, and it was converted for high-speed minesweeping. It was about 300 feet long and about 32 feet wide, and it had a speed of 35 knots. And it didn't have much armor. It had a 3-inch cannon on the front deck, and it had two twin 40 anti-aircraft on the rear. And it was equipped for minesweeping and mine laying. When he appointed me, I said, "Can't I stay aboard the Terror?" The Terror was a beautiful new cruiser, and they had a beautiful medical department. And he says, "No," he says, "we have a full complement. We have plenty of doctors on this ship. The Dorsey doesn't have any." And I said to him, "You know," he says, "I just came from a brief internship at County Hospital, and the only experience I had in surgery was 2 months of gynecology." So he said to me, "You're a medical officer with the United States Navy. Good luck and Godspeed." And he sent me off. We got into a motor whaleboat, the coxswain and myself, and I had my duffel bag. And we were at one end of the atoll, and we had to go about 15 miles to where the Dorsey was at anchor. And en route to the Dorsey, we came under air attack. The Japanese attacked while I was in the motor whaleboat, and we saw the Japanese bombers and kamikazes fly in, and they did a lot of damage. They hit the USS Randolph, which was a huge carrier, did a lot of damage there. They weren't interested in this tiny whaleboat that I was in. When we got to the Dorsey, it was at sundown, and the Dorsey didn't have a gangplank. It had a rope ladder, and I had to climb up on the side of the ship, the rope ladder, and get aboard. And the Dorsey, by the way, is the identical ship that the K Mutiny was written about. In fact, when they did the movie, The K Mutiny, they had no ships of the Dorsey class left. And the ship that you saw in the movie, The K Mutiny, was a modern destroyer, not the one from World War I. When I got aboard the Dorsey, I walked into the wardroom. You had to walk through a hole in the deck, down a steel ladder into the wardroom. And on a table about this size were huge volumes of documents marked top secret, and the entire naval operation for the invasion of Okinawa was outlined. And they never had a medical officer on the Dorsey. They just had a pharmacist's mate. And he showed me what facilities they had. And the only medical facilities we had was a medical locker off the bulkhead. It had a little sterilizer and some medical supplies, some penicillin. Penicillin wasn't available for the civilians at that time. I said, we have to get some Vaseline gauze. We have to make some Vaseline gauze because if we get hit, there'll be a lot of burns. And he says, "Doctor," he says, "I admire your ability to try to get us prepared for that, but if we get hit, we're going down." He says, we lost 6 ships in the invasion of the Philippines, and none of them survived. Anyway, so we took off. The very next morning, we took off for the invasion of Okinawa, and there was a huge armada. There were 10 battleships with 16-inch guns, 2 communication ships, and 15 cruisers, and 35 destroyers. Our destroyer was one of in the outer ring, and we went up to Okinawa, which was 1,500 miles away, at full speed, and it was rough. It was very rough. The very first morning, I got called to see a sailor who was ill, and he had a classic case of appendicitis. And I told the captain, I says, "You know, we have this kid that has acute appendicitis." He says, "Operate." I says, operate. He says, you can't even stand without holding on. It was so rough. He says, well, do the best you can. We're going to be refueling tomorrow from the battleship Nevada. The Dorsey couldn't go 1,500 miles at top speed without refueling. So we had to refuel from the battleship. And the next morning, we refueled, and we transferred this sailor by a breeches buoy. But before we transferred him, for the 10 hours he was aboard the Dorsey, I started an IV and put the penicillin. We had little ampules, 20,000 units of penicillin per ampule. And I gave him some intravenous penicillin and some morphine. And the next morning he was transferred, and he was operated on the Nevada. The Nevada, several days later, was hit by a kamikaze. This kid survived the kamikaze attack, but I found out later in May he was transferred to the USS Terror, which was the original ship that I went on, the flagship for the entire Pacific Mine Fleet. And the Terror was hit by a twin-engine bomber at Okinawa, and this kid was killed. So when your number is up, it's up, I guess. The Dorsey, when we got to Okinawa, the Dorsey and the destroyers and the minesweepers took off. The battleships were behind the horizon, shelling the beaches. And the Dorsey came fairly close to shore, maybe 2,000 yards offshore, and did a high-speed minesweeping. And there were a lot of mines at Okinawa. And on March 27th at dawn, I was on the bridge, and you could see the arching of the shells from the battleship overhead hitting the beach. And each battleship had a different colored smoke. And there were spotter planes over the beach, and the spotter planes would wire back to the battleships where the smoke went, so they would know where the targets were. And they would change the coordinates, and then you'd see another volley of shells come over, and you get the report that they were right out, they hit the target. And at dawn, 3 planes came off the beach, and they flew over us, and the gunners of our ship hit one of the planes. And the plane started to smoke, and the pilot apparently realized he couldn't get to the battleships or the cruisers that were shelling the shore. They weren't interested in a small ship like the Dorsey. The Dorsey was close enough to shore that they could have picked us off with their shore battery, but they didn't want to expose their gun positions by hitting a small target. So this plane that was smoking made a huge turn, came around to our port side, and hit our ship about 50 feet from where I was standing. And fortunately, the bomb on the plane was a dud. It didn't explode. It killed 3 men and wounded several, and did a lot of damage. The ship could no longer minesweep. The ship was equipped for acoustical minesweeping, magnetic minesweeping, and anchored minesweeping. So our minesweeping gear was destroyed, and we continued afterwards as a mine destruction vessel. And we stayed at Okinawa for another 5 days, and we headed back with the first group of damaged ships. We went back to Pearl Harbor. And April 7th, we were at Guam, and we heard that FDR died when we were at Guam. We got back to Pearl Harbor, and the captain said, Greenwald, he says, they're not going to send us back. The ship was too beaten up. We're going to probably go back to San Diego. They'll use us for towing targets. It'll be easy duty. We're going to ask that you remain aboard.
Wrap it up.
Yeah. Okay, so he came back that night, and he says that your ship is going to be through here in a month or so. We're going to transfer you to the Naval Hospital at Pearl Harbor. And I spent 2 months at Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital taking care of the casualties being flown in from Okinawa. Then when the picket came through, we went back to Okinawa, and our ships, the minesweepers at Okinawa, are getting prepared for the invasion of Kyushu when the bomb dropped. And after the bomb dropped, our plans changed and we went to Tokyo. And there was a lot of bad weather. There were 2 typhoons at that time, so the surrender service was delayed by 2 weeks. And during that 2 weeks, we were in a holding pattern off an area called Point Look, about 600 miles south of Tokyo. And the Pickett, the second ship I was on, was the first ship into Tokyo Bay. We swept Tokyo Bay for the surrender services. We got into Tokyo Bay at dawn on August 28th. And the surrender was September 2nd. It was a gray overcast day, and the B-29s were overhead, and the Pickett was anchored about 1,000 yards from the Missouri, and I could see the surrender services through my glasses on the deck of the Missouri. It's pretty exciting.
Okay, Bernie, we're going to have...
Okay.
Any questions to Bernie? We got one over there, over there.
Any questions?
Short question.
I was on a mine layer not far from there, but we had a kid on the Terror, too, on temporary duty that was killed.
You were on the Terror?
No. On the Monadnock, a small mine layer, but we had a guy on the over on the Terror on temporary duty, and they got hit and he was killed.
Any other question?
The medical officer that talked to me was also killed on the Terror, and the other medical officer had his arm blown off.
Okay. Okay, Bernie, thank you. Last we have Barney.
I'm a veteran of World War II by dint of Congress. I never fought a war. I enlisted in the Army at 17. I had finished high school at 16 and a half. And at that time, there was no draft. They were discharging them right and left. The war was over. My parents signed my form, and I went and enlisted. And they sent me to Anniston, Alabama. In Anniston, Alabama, was a National Guard unit that had sat out the entire war. And all of a sudden, these guys were activated, and you know how happy they seemed to be. A group of us joined them. We had our basic training there, and then they shipped us on the troop ship General Stewart to Bremerhaven, the repo depot. And in Bremerhaven, we disembarked, but they called a number of men, and I was one of them, and they had transferred me and all of the other, quote, volunteers, unquote, to the Bremerhaven repo depot. And we were going to be a baseball team. And the rest of my friends from Alabama went on into the infantry, were transferred into the Army of Occupation there. We were in Bremerhaven exactly 1 week. And they called us out, only the baseball team. They called us out one day and said, we're now attached to the Ansbach Signal Corps School, Ansbach, Germany, and it was a NATO school. There were, aside from U.S. troops, there were NATO troops learning how to use our communications equipment. So I had volunteered to the Signal Corps. When we got there, the school was magnificent. It had been a German artillery officers training school. The buildings were giant castle buildings. They had a parade ground that ran on forever, and they had a commander whose name was Lieutenant Colonel Abramowitz. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Abramowitz was actually a master sergeant in the regular Army, but in the reserve, he became a lieutenant colonel, and they gave him a Signal Corps school. So we, en masse, he had commandeered a baseball team, and he wanted to get this school as known as, or as well known as West Point. So he wanted a baseball team, he wanted a boxing team, he wanted a football team in the wintertime, whatever. But in order to keep us there as players, there's no MOS for baseball player or jock, but there are 50,000 MOSs in communications. So we were sent to a Diddy Dum Dum school to learn Morse code. That was 8 weeks. We were sent to a school to learn telephone repair. There was a field of nothing but poles, and we were learning how to climb up and down the poles. It was a magnificent field and a magnificent school. And what we did basically was work in classes, learning radio, learning long-distance communications, everything that had to do with communications until Friday. Friday night, they would put us in a gorgeous big bus that the artillery officers used, and we would drive to anywhere, Nuremberg, etc., and play a baseball team there. And then Saturday we played a baseball team, and Sunday we might have played a baseball team. And we came back, and I did this for 2 summers in Ansbach, Germany. Congress had passed a law that allowed us, since I was in the Army of Occupation and in Germany, etc., I was entitled to be a World War II veteran. I enjoyed that. You know, we played, we worked, we learned. To this day, I hear Morse code. I can read some of it. After that, the Army, the military was discharging right and left. I mean, everything. We were supposed to be a Signal Corps company, but we became a Signal Corps detachment because there weren't enough people left there to be a company. And then somebody cut me orders, and I ended up in Salzburg, Austria. We were in charge of all of the landlines, telephone lines, coming in from Austria and going into Germany. Now, again, it was a beautiful building. It was like an AT&T building that you would find in Chicago, except that everything was in German. We couldn't even read the meters, much less repair anything. But we had the engineer who had designed the air raid warning system for Berlin was now working for us. So we would call him when something went wrong, and he would take care of it. Our duty hours were, you know, usually we were on duty late in the evening, so we would pass the time playing gin rummy, playing poker, on and on and on. And that was the first year in Salzburg. And of course, it was the war was over. They celebrated the Mozart anniversary, and it was magnificent. I mean, everywhere you went, every single house had some musician in there playing piano, violin, whatever. but all through the city of Salzburg, you heard nothing but music. And I thought I was going to finish my Army career. I would have loved it in Salzburg. It's a great place there. But my mother got sick, and they flew me back to Brooklyn, which was my home. And I spent 2 weeks there, and then they shipped me to Fort Dix, where I ended up my World War II term. So that's basically my story. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have a question here from Don.
As part of the Army of Occupation, how well were you received by the people wherever you were, the local people?
1946 and 47, we weren't very well received. There were a number of incidents through Germany, particularly, with Hitler Youth, who didn't realize, if you've seen pictures, you've seen a Jeep with a cutting bar in the front, and that was because they would put piano wires across the road. And so we would drive Jeeps with a window shield down, but one or two guys got caught in that, and after that they started putting these cutting shields on the front of all these Jeeps. So they were not very friendly with us, except occasionally some of the officers would bring food to girlfriends, etc. But there was no love lost.
Jay?
You were in Anniston, Alabama at Fort McClellan, I presume. Well,
Not there.
you're a youngster, but I was there for basic training, and I went back there as a drill instructor.
Mud.
So I
Nothing but mud.
I left there in 45,
Oh, okay.
after the war was over.
Well, there's no more Fort McClellan.
No.
They've closed that. I can't tell you the reaction that we had, or that they had, when they had a bunch of us young fellas coming into a National Guard. They had been together for forever, and these people had gotten in promotions. They trained 1 week a month. They got automatic promotions, et cetera, et cetera. Now they were part of the regular Army, and they didn't like it. By the way,
Question over there.
oh,
If my calculations are correct, you're all talking about something that happened 74 years ago. And I'm absolutely flabbergasted at the memory of all of you about all the important details of things that happened and so on. Did you make notes or something like that you then later on at that time?
I didn't make any notes.
Because I can't remember hardly anything from 74 years ago.
I became a switch hitting catcher. He wanted one catcher. We only had one catcher, and he wanted a left-handed batter and a right-handed batter. So I became a switch hitter.
Talking about memories of 70 years ago, I can remember that, but I can't remember where I put my glasses.
I want to thank the panel. Before it's opened up for any questions, can I have those that were in World War II raise your hand? Okay. Can I have those that fought in
Spanish-American War.
anybody that fought in any war? Raise your hand. Okay. Those that want to ask anybody a question, you can do so now. And we have a question there. Is it this one over there?
This is directed at Ralph Westfall. Ralph was one of the great deans at UIC. How many years were you there, and what are the connections between your military and being an academic?
Well, I don't think there was any connection between my academic career and the military. Once I got out of the Army, that was it. I was 10 years at UIC and enjoyed it. We had an interesting time. Well, not to take it back. One, about to forget, one time there, the ROTC unit wanted somebody to go with a visit the summer training camp, and the commander I'd gotten a little acquainted with, he knew I'd been in the Army, and he asked me if I would come down to Fort Drum in Kentucky for a week while they were there, and that was my only Army connection after that.
Okay,
Yeah.
last question from Don Packard.
Yeah, I have a question. A lot of you, well, here's what I'd like to know. You mentioned Omaha Beach, you mentioned Pearl Harbor. Have any of you been back to the locale to see what it's like today? In other words, since your service time, Philippines, Omaha Beach, Pearl Harbor, what did you feel? What did you think if you did return?
I was back to the Philippines, but long after the war, and no connection at all. I was a tourist in the Philippines.
Okay, I want to thank the group again.
Wait, he's got to sing it.
I was in Tokyo before the surrender service, and I saw the devastation in Tokyo. I was also in Hiroshima 6 weeks after the bomb was dropped, and I was there more recently, and it was tremendous. You never could tell that anything happened there. And the way to have a city rebuilt is to lose it in the war, and then it'll be rebuilt.
Thank
Once
you for
again,
your
we want to thank
service.
the group. Go ahead. Go ahead, Glenn.
And thank you, Lou Solomon.
I just want to thank the group again. Turn this on. I want to thank the group again for participating in this event. Thank you.